everybody. So yes, we have another question. This is from Islanders Caper, who asks, "What were your biggest writing inspirations?" And let's talk to David first.
So I assume you mean which other writers were my biggest inspiration?
It's the question's unclear, so I feel like you can interpret it however you like.
Let's go with that then. Gene Wolfe is my biggest inspiration as a writer. I think I've read probably everything he's ever written, and I'm constantly amazed by the man's brilliance and insight and subtleness, and I think it's fantastic. I also read a lot of the classics, so H.G. Wells, John Wyndham. I get real pleasure from rereading these. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, Dracula. These are the things that I wish I had written. Michael Moorcock, and this is just turning into a list of writers, isn't it? And I think really the inspiration to actually go and do it happened a few years ago when my son had a band, and they played a gig and they videoed it, and I showed it to a friend at work, and he said, "Oh, that's great. That's really fantastic." I had a band when I was a kid, but I was almost too afraid to perform. And I realized that fear was holding me back from doing a whole lot of things that I wanted to do. And I wasn't going to let it happen anymore. I was just going to do it. And I may not be very good at it. I may not be very successful, but I'm doing it. And I'm getting pleasure and joy from it. And I'm not afraid. And that's what really inspired me, was my friend John Colley, who's now passed away. And as far as I know, never actually did go out and gig. But he gave me the insight into what was stopping me from doing things that I wanted to do.
Well, thank you, David. That's very lovely, and the world is richer for your having decided to overcome your fear and get your stuff out into the world.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying
that. Erynn.
Hi.
Hi. So what were your biggest writing inspirations?
Okay, so on the cultured side of things, on the actually cultured side of things, I've read Paradise Lost, I've read Faust, I've read a lot of mythological and religious texts from all over the world, and I love questions of the value and nature of humanity, and I love questions of what counts as a human and what counts as a person and how that's separate from a human. I mean, but let's be clear here, what inspired me to start writing was the Sonic the Hedgehog comic books. I've read all these amazing cultured things, and they were all great for holding civil and intellectual conversation with my parents' weird theater friends over the years. But at the end of the day, the Sonic the Hedgehog comic books, they are really early in them. They kind of didn't know what to do, and the writers were big fans of Star Wars and Star Trek and stuff. A lot of the sci-fi that was like popular in the 90s. And they introduced a lot of really weird universal elements into the series, and it was all very odd. Echidnas were all Jedi for some reason. It was all very strange. But this one writer, Ian Flynn, came in, and he's just like, this isn't very much like the Sonic games, but this is also a really cool universe, so let's reconcile them and make something really good. And he made this fantastic sci-fi fantasy universe out of it by reconciling and fixing and retconning and doing whatever he needed to do to make the comics work out really well. And then a previous writer for the comics, Ken Penders, went and copyrighted all the characters he had made for the comics, even though they should have been owned by Sega and Archie at that point. And they had to reboot the continuity so they didn't have to pay him royalties. And it was the loss of a fantastic world when they did that. But everything Ian Flynn has done since is fantastic, and I follow him very closely on almost any project he's on, because he's just such, like, he can make something from nothing. He is such a resourceful writer.
Well, thank you. And hello to whoever that was who made an appearance behind you there. Not Sheila.
Oh, that was Ransel. Ransel, what? Ransel, I'm sorry, I was so busy talking about Sonic that I didn't give you pets.
Hugh, what were your biggest writing inspirations?
Oh, when I was a teenager, I watched 2001 about 30 times. Never on drugs, but it made a huge impact. And I read masses of Marvel comics, and I had lots of stuff. And I read all the science fiction classics. And
oh dear, I think we're lagging again.
Oh dear.
He's returned to his home planet. It's okay. They needed him.
Oh, yeah, that checks out.
It really does.
am I back there yet?
Yes.
You're back.
Okay. So I did all that. I think the interesting thing for me was that there were two factors. One is I didn't actually start out as a writer. I wanted to be an illustrator, an artist. And when I was 14, my father made me a drawing board, because he was doing a lot of woodwork as a hobby. And it was this massive thing. And I used to sort of draw my own comics.
That was another cutoff.
To access the rest of this story, please insert $6.
It's random. You get a different outcome depending on how much money you pay.
That's right.
It's a choose your own adventure, but it's somebody else's life. It's like
That's
Roy
right.
the game from Rick and Morty.
That's
Yeah.
another story idea here.
I was thinking more of when shows in the early 2000s tried to combine their websites with their shows. So, like in the second season of Heroes, someone would do something unrelated to the plot and walk off, and you'd get like, to find out the rest of that story, go to the website. It's like, no, freaking tell me it now on the show. I'm not going to your damn website.
That's not how TV
What show
works.
was that?
I'm not gonna lie, I love multimedia
Second season of
stuff like
Heroes.
that,
Oh,
And there
Heroes.
were other shows I gather doing.
I blotted that from my mind.
though. I'm not gonna lie, I love multimedia stuff like that though.
Well, I love when they have it. I don't like when they force you. They shove it in your face like that. That's just me.
Oh yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
It's kind of like
I don't know.
It's kind of like in comics when
You are back, Hugh.
there's a story. You know, you're following along this story in one series of comics, and then you have to go into an entirely different series to find out the end of that story because it's a crossover.
Yeah.
I hate that.
That was yes. Reading it was great when Marvel did the continuity thing so they could tell longer stories. But yeah, you would get things where don't know what happened on between page 16 and 17. Go watch the latest to get the latest issue of this, and it's like no.
Oh man.
I hated that. But on the other
I'm just
hand,
gonna say-
I love the fact of continuity. I mean, I love when I was a kid in the 70s reading The Hulk. There was the story that introduced an obscure character called the Bi-Beast. And I don't know why that hasn't been adopted as like an icon for by some people, but the Bi-Beast was on a city 8 miles above the Earth that had previously been inhabited by bird people. And as a kid, you just accept that because comics. But that was actually a reference to something that had been published in a comic back in the 40s that Marvel owned the rights to.
This was a thing that I loved.
Because they're not shoving it in our face. It's there as part of the story. And I could go back years later and find out that whole history that they drew on. Versus you're not going to understand the next page unless you buy this other issue. Which is kind of getting far away from the story, except to say, I think everything I've ever read or watched has influenced me for a writer. Whether it was a positive thing, yeah, that's a really cool story, or a really way to do character, or a negative thing where you say, wow, that's just stupid. Remind me to write the opposite of that, or whatever.
I just want to add one thing that I got cut off when I was. It's more important about what I was saying earlier than I was saying earlier. Take lots of long walks, sometimes by yourself and sometimes with friends, and talk about stuff. Talk about your friends or yourself. I found that was sort of the formative years of trying to become a writer or any kind of creative person. So I needed those long walks, and that was great about living the prairie, is you had to take long walks to get from anywhere to anywhere. Because it was very far apart with lots of space between them and time to contemplate. So that's all.
Thank you, Hugh. It was good we could finally hear the end of your answer there.
That tedious story, yes.
Gary, what were your biggest writing inspirations?
I agree with David that if I listed them all, it would turn into this laundry list of big authors. So I'll list two that have stuck in my mind for so long. One, and I'm going to recommend everybody read this. It's Ian MacDonald's River of Gods. It is such a special book. It's India in the year 2047, and it is pretty amazing. But what makes it so special is that it's a super thick, hard sci-fi book, and it's 60 pages, but then the last 30 to 50 pages are all just constant plot twists that aren't gimmicky, but actually like blow your mind for like 30 pages straight. It's almost like if a stand-up comedian did 10 minutes of setup for a 5-minute long joke, or if you've played the video game BioShock Ultimate, the last 20 minutes where it's just twist, twist, twist every minute. And it's just mind blowing. So there's that. And then aside from that, I think John Steinbeck, everybody seems to read like Grapes of Wrath or East of Eden. But just if you read even his obscure works, he just has such a way with characters. So I would really recommend everything that he's done. And that's two of my biggest inspirations.
Thank you. Simon.
Oh, right. I'm here. So we're talking about inspirations, right? So,
yes.
Aside from me.
So, inspirations. Well, I mean, anyone who's read my book knows that I took pretty strongly from Paradise Lost as a source, but also, if we're talking about actual writers and such who inspired me to write the way I do, I'm going to say probably Terry Pratchett and George R.R. Martin, which is not exactly a deep, well-read thing. But the thing about, I say Martin because when I was reading the Song of Ice and Fire, while I enjoyed them as books, I also, more so than I had with any other sort of book series, I sort of started to understand why things happened the way they did, not so much just like in a plot sense, but like in a sort of a structure sense. How one event, what seemed like a random bit of violence played into a much progression of the story in a certain direction. And I felt like when I started reading those books, I really started to understand how a story is made. And yeah, so I'd say those are my inspirations. I suppose my dad is also something of an inspiration.
Thank you.
I have also found the same thing with the works of Brandon Sanderson. And I love his books, the ones that I've read, and every time I read one, there's so much that goes into it, and yet somehow it's easy to see how all the elements come together and make a good book. And I find they're really good for kind of understanding how all the different pieces of a book come together. So, Stephen, your biggest writing inspirations?
For my writing, Frank Herbert, Homer, more the Odyssey than the Iliad. And for my life, J.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Don't write anything like him, but as a template for how to live, his characters cover the bases.
Very good. Well, thank you for all your answers, everybody. If there's anything else that people in the chat are wondering, feel free to chime in. We've got a little bit over our time here, so I don't know if anybody has plans that they need to get to for the evening. I'm just about out of my drink here.
I ran out of tea ages ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned in some of my early video streams that I need to go with the big bottle when I'm doing something like this.
Mine's out.
Well, to be fair, the kettle is right behind me. I could actually stay on camera and go get more tea, but nah.
Be quality programming though.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'd be off camera for a very short while as I walked around the couch.
And the way Google Meet is set up, it would focus on you because that's where all the activity is.
Everybody gets to see me walk around the couch.
Yes.
Well, actually, there's still some Coca-Cola in this can.
Ooh.
Product placement too.
Yeah.
We've
I
got
did not
everything
think-
here. Well, I think, we've gone a few minutes over. Everybody's had a chance to talk about your stories. Unless there's anything anybody would like to add.
I have one thing to add, actually.
Please do.
Because a lot of my inspiration has been comic books and animation and similar such media, I've become a very visual storyteller, and I know a lot of other people here cited watching shows or reading comics as something that inspired them at some point. So I actually just wanted to know if anybody else here, how that has influenced them, how multiple medias have influenced them to writing prose, basically.
Anyone like to take that?
Well, I guess I can try and say something on that. I try to sort of dabble in most mediums to some degree. I'd say I play a lot of video games, and I'll say that I think the video games are kind of this weird thing where they don't really, even now, there's not really this. Different people different people have different ideas. People have different ideas of what they are, and so sometimes you'll have these completely not they're games. They're like Pong or Space Invaders or all the sort of very basic, almost like they're like analogs to sort of real sports or real games. And then you have like these much more detailed stories, very like elaborate worlds and such that you sort of inhabit. And I think what makes them interesting though is that because of this sort of unsure nature, they often have elements that are just completely nuts at times. They don't always follow the real rules of storytelling. The sort of rules of storytelling you sort of assume are there. And so I often find I'm more inclined to one of the reasons I find myself drawn to them, even if their stories aren't necessarily as good as, say, a book or a movie, is they're just so weird. And I like that weirdness. I like to sort of use that weirdness. I like to find ways to make that weirdness make sense in a story. And yeah.
Oh, good.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I at one point, some of my favorite movies in the past have been like the films of Robert Altman. which all have 7,000 characters and go all over the place and then come back together. And things like American Graffiti or Dazed and Confused, where you've got kind of almost like a small army of characters that end up being a story of some kind. And I know that in the case of the Con, which is coming out, that was a direct influence. This idea that if you're going to write about a novel set at a science fiction convention, or it's actually there's a science fiction convention and a meeting of the Jane Austen Society in the same hotel, and it would have to be that kind of story. So I was thinking partially, and it's a literary piece, it's a written piece, I was thinking partially in those cinematic terms of how do you bring all these different characters from different places so that it adds up to something coherent. But at the same time, all of these characters have their place in the story. So so that was an influence, because honestly, I don't really play video games.
Anybody else?
I'll just say with me, I love comic books. I cannot draw flies if I'm covered in syrup. I just do not have that capacity. Consequently, I had to learn to do description with words if I was going to have any kind of expression whatsoever. So it's sort of like it's all ground up into the mill and then it comes out in a different form.
I was going to say that
Go ahead.
You're there.
yeah, am I there here?
You're there.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, I was just going to say about other media is that one of the things I have done as a writer that maybe some of the other group hasn't is I often adapt my short stories for radio as radio dramas, because I love the cinematography in most radio. They look great inside my head. And actually, as I say, it's an interesting discipline because writing prose fiction is very different than articulating things in sound. And I've had some success. There's a group in San Francisco, Shoestring Radio Theater, that's performed a lot of the short stories, and it's interesting. And it's interesting to see how people do that. And in a similar way, I commissioned an artist to do illustrations of my short stories. She was interested in science fiction, and it's, again, very interesting. I actually try to stay away from the other artists while they're doing this because I don't want to influence them too much, because I'm just genuinely curious to see the result. Usually I'm, not always, but usually I'm really delighted. So anyway.
I've been in similar situations to that, actually. I have hand tremors, so I'm never going to be able to draw really seriously. I make like basic references of my characters and such because it's important to me to have that. But I have to use a whole lot of like line smoothing software and vector lines and just a lot of digital artistic tools to make it not look like a squiggly line constantly. So I'm fascinated by the overlap between artistic mediums and storytelling, partially as a result of never being able to do anything super visual myself.
I do think graphic novels are a very interesting medium, and especially there's such a variety in the types of storytelling in graphic novels and just the kind of confluence of the art and the writing that is very fascinating, and it's a completely different thing. I actually have a standalone comic idea that I've had scripted for, I don't think I want to admit how long. Perhaps one of these years I will end up drawing it. But yeah, it's really interesting, especially these days, how there's a lot more multimedia coming together. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I just wanted to encourage everyone who thinks they can't draw. I mean, often with visual communication, it's not necessarily trying to draw something as realistically or photographically as possible. You know, even if your hands tremble or you can't make a line, you can still. There's a lot of people doing excellent visual communication, particularly in the area of graphic novels. That don't actually aren't great drafts people. You know, they use their visual arts in a different way. So don't give up if you really want to try.
It's more of a stamina problem for me, actually. The trouble with the tremors is that the strain of holding my hand still hurts my wrist after a while.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, okay. But
I've tried. I have tried really hard, and I'm always trying to improve my art so that I can one day do something with it.
It's like writing. Just find a way to express yourself, and might be surprised what you end up with. Is it Anne Beaton that did Hark a Vagrant, Simon?
Yeah.
That cartoonist Anne Beaton, is it? I can't remember her name. The lady who wrote Hark a Vagrant, those cartoon books.
Oh, those are great.
Yeah, she has a very simple style, not at all realistic, and I think there's some of the best things in
Kate Beaton.
Kate Beaton. She's so many, but anyway.
Well, thank you for a great discussion, everyone. Is there anything else anybody would like to add before we start signing off?
Thank you.
Going once, going twice.
Thanks to everyone. And just let me say, the power's in you. Please review.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yes,
it's true.
please.
It's true, actually. Yeah.
Take it, give a good review.
Yes.
That's right. If you don't, just be very, very quiet.
Give it 5 stars anyway. Make it an
Try not to spoil it without tags.
Yes.
Give it a review to help my self-esteem for how bad my conversation skills have been this whole time.
No. Great.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
I hope we can do a panel at an actual con sometime in the near future.
I hope so too.
You know, in the post-COVID, or maybe they'll have cons and we'll all be wearing, you know, spacesuits so that we don't spread viruses.
Hazmat suits.
That is another story idea that I may have to follow up on.
Oh my God,
Hazmat
that's
suit.
an excellent idea.
But I'm certainly glad we were able to do this because, I mean, obviously, Gary and even more so David, you guys are physically so much farther away than the rest of us. So it was really nice to have all of you in here and chatting together and getting to see you face to face for the first time, David. It's been lovely.
Been lovely indeed. Yes, it has. It's been nice to see everyone that I've never met before. And yeah, no, it's good. Thank you for making me welcome, and hopefully, it wasn't awkward for me. Hopefully, it wasn't awkward for you.
It's been lovely. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you, chat, for joining us. And hope you have a great evening, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See y'all.
Bye.